All right, welcome everybody. I think it's the top of the hour, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Hi, I'm Madison Langseth with the USGS, US Geological Survey. Let me, say that out. And I'm the co-lead for the ESEP Research Artifact Citation Cluster, along with Mark Parsons, who's with University of Alabama, Huntsville. And together with the rest of our cluster, we're convening this session. So first, I'd like to welcome all of our speakers and participants, both those who are here with us in person, as well as those of you who are joining us virtually. As we get started, we'd really appreciate it if you would please record your name, your affiliation, pronouns, and location in our notes document, which I apologize, I don't have a bit.ly link to that. But actually, you should be able to get through through Kiko chat. Let's see. Forgot that I have slides, so I can go ahead and do this. There we go. As a reminder, by participating in this session, you agree to adhere to the ESEP community participation guidelines. So I think we all probably are aware of those by now, but in case we missed it, essentially we expect everyone to be respectful, direct but professional and inclusive. We ask everyone to understand different perspectives, appreciate and accommodate our similarities and our differences, and lead by example. If there is an issue, you can use the link that's either in my slides, if you can find my slides, or in our notes document if you need to make a report. All right, so the goal for this session is to understand existing challenges with assigning and recognizing credit for research artifacts, such as data and software, and establish what the ESEP Research Artifact Citation Cluster can do to improve credit for these research artifacts. Previous iterations of this cluster and the Data Stewardship Committee were responsible for publishing data and software citation guidelines, and we're looking for similarly impactful projects to take on. We're looking to prioritize and set a new direction for the cluster, so this is the time for you, the community, to tell us what the priorities are related to citation. Okay, so next, Mark is going to share some conclusions from a newly published Eos paper documenting recent cluster activities. Then following Mark's overview, we will hear from 5 presenters discussing mechanisms and challenges that they see for assigning and recognizing credit for research artifacts. We will wrap up this session with a sticky note activity to get input from all of you, both those here in the room as well as folks who are participating remotely. Now, before we get into those presentations, I want to talk a little bit about the purpose of having these presentations. So essentially, we are hoping that our presenters will get everyone thinking about credit challenges that you yourself or your colleagues face and resources that you may need to overcome those challenges. So therefore, we're not planning to have a question and answer segment following their presentations. If you do have questions for our presenters, you can put them in chat for the presenter to answer there, or you can catch up with them during one of our remaining breaks. So maybe tonight or tomorrow. And instead, what we want you to do is to be thinking about these questions that I have here on the screen, since we're going to be asking you to answer them during our sticky note activity. So the first one being, what challenges have you seen?
Madison?
Yes.
I don't think you're sharing your screen.
I'm not sharing my screen. Okay, let me deal with that then.
Sorry for interrupting.
Nope, I appreciate that you did interrupt me. How do I get back to Zoom? You got me just in time because this is the screen, the slide in particular that I would like folks to see. So maybe, duplicate. Okay, that took a while, but are you now seeing my screen? Okay, excellent. Okay, so First question, what challenges have you seen or experienced related to assigning or recognizing credit for research artifacts? Second question, what types of resources, tools, information, or policies would help you provide or receive better credit for your research artifacts? And then the final one, how can authorities such as promotion, hiring, funding committees, professional societies, or publishers be encouraged to recognize contributions to data products and other research artifacts? Okay, so I'm not going to get into this. We'll come back here. But what I want to do is invite Mark Parsons to give us the overview of the Eos paper. Okay, what does the PDF look like? Okay, perfect.
How do I make it full screen? Aha. Okay. Thanks, Madison. Yeah, so I'm just going to give a little overview on what the cluster has been doing over the last couple of years. So as Madison mentioned, ESIP has data citation guidelines. They were first published way back in 2010. They were endorsed by ESIP in 2012. It was actually the first endorsed ESIP product. And then they were recently updated in 2019. And then another cluster did software and service citation guidelines, also endorsed in 2019. And so the research artifact citation cluster was formed in 2018, first to update the data citation guidelines, but then we really wanted to consider citation more broadly. And we were wondering, can we define guidelines for citation of all research objects? We used to call them research objects, now we call them research artifacts. Research objects has meanings in some communities. But all we mean is things that researchers produce that are deserving of recognition. And so can we define these general guidelines? It appears not really. And then we asked, do we need to separate the multiple concerns that are embedded in citation, particularly credit and access? Those are two very different concerns. And we concluded, yes, we do. And then how do we do that? Well, that's what we're trying to figure out. We summarized the work to that date in an iPoster at AGU, if you're curious. But then after that, we really turned to this issue of credit, and we really focused on the issue of credit. And so how these different artifacts should be recognized, and how does the credit taxonomy, which some of you may have heard of, it's used by many journals that specifies the different roles that were used in producing a paper, whether that would apply to other artifacts, or are there perhaps other taxonomies. So the work we did resulted in this article in Eos. I recommend you all check it out. You can't see the URL, but you can find it at Eos. But anyway, how do I make this go away?
You might be able to move it.
Yeah, but yes, I'll have to be able to drive this computer. All right, that's all right. So here's the basic approach we took. The question was, can we try and define a general way to credit research artifacts? And so we started with sort of defining what we meant by research artifacts, and we came up with 24 different ones because we were pretty granular, so like models, software, services, data, et cetera. We then clustered those down into 9 clusters of artifacts, and then we boiled that even further down to 5 for the purposes of a face-to-face meeting. I think it was face-to-face, the first one, meeting that we wanted to look at in detail. And so those are data, software, physical samples, semantic artifacts, so things like ontologies and taxonomies, things like that, and then learning resources. And we went through an exercise. So this was over the course of several ESIP meetings, and we went through an exercise where we identified, we assessed it against credit to start with, found that credit didn't really work, that taxonomy doesn't really work for things other than papers. And so we identified some missing roles and some other taxonomies to examine. And then we considered looking at each of those roles and each of those artifacts, sort of the level of recognition that would be necessary for those artifacts. And we classified the level of recognition as authorship, so you're a primary contributor, something that would, akin to acknowledgements in a paper, recognition, but not so formal. And then finally, maybe something buried in the metadata that to indicate it. So sort of, high, medium, low levels of recognition. And again, we found we really needed to have more work on this, and we decided to just, there was no overarching conclusion that emerged, so we found we really needed to focus more. So we like data, we focused really down on data, and we looked specifically at the roles that would be worthy of authorship in a data citation. And we used the contributor role ontology, as well as some other roles, and we actually started weighting the roles to think about how they would be used for different types of data. So we looked at like remote sensing data, model output, field collections, physical sample data derived from physical samples, et cetera. And we found some commonality that some roles emerged, but there were a lot of differences to be considered for authorship. So the paper explains all this in detail, and the basic takeaways is that no one basic credit approach or taxonomy suffice for even a plurality of artifacts. It's really very diverse. But there is some consensus, particularly on the concept of conceptualization, which is a concept that comes from the credit taxonomy, but it's in others as well. But that seems to always emerge as an important concept that's worthy of high recognition. The person who had the idea for the thing is critical. And then really what it seems like is when thinking about these artifacts, you have to take a sort of a case-by-case basis. And it really should be a discussion early on that teams should discuss the necessary roles that were involved and how they should be recognized. And you should be as specific as possible, use persistent identifiers for everything, the artifacts, the people, et cetera. And then we really, ultimately, we need to think about credit beyond the scope of citation. We get really hung up on this notion of citation in science because that's how we have measured credit traditionally, and all we care about is papers, but we care about much more than papers now. So we looked at things like narrative CVs, which is kind of a thing that's emerging, where you sort of tell the story of your career rather than just sort of listing your publications. Richer metadata that you can capture much more information in the metadata. And then ultimately what we'd love to see is some sort of network graph interconnecting the artifacts, the processes, and the people. So that was sort of the takeaway from that article, and that's sort of where we are with the cluster now. And now we're trying to figure out what next, as Madison said. So thanks. I will now pass it back to the speakers.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, Mark. So next up, we have Leslie Wyborn, who's from the Australian National University, where she works on a variety of topics related to data science, ranging in scales from long tail, like geochemistry, to exascale, such as geophysics. Her presentation is going to be giving credit where it is due through successive levels of processing in a vertically integrated data set. And go. Let's do this.
Good.
Okay, hold on. There you go.
So is it just the down arrow?
What's that?
What's the way?
So the down arrow should move it. You might need to click on it.
Okay. All right, so before I start, I wear many hats. This is going to be a high performance related computing talk. Before I really get going, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, seas and waters of the areas that I live and work and meet on, and I acknowledge their continuing connection to their culture and pay my respects to the elders past, present and future. What on earth do you mean by vertically integrated data set? It means that you're linking and integrating derivative data sets along what we call the full path of data from the source data set to the multiple derivative products, usually related to derivative various processing levels, as opposed to horizontal, where you take a couple of data sets and merge them together in a GIS or use one to calibrate the other. So this is, as we all know, the NASA levels, which have been around since the beginning of time, L0, 1, 2, 3, 4. And what the hell do you mean by the full path of data? So this is an example from the ASTA mission, where you started out with level 0, level 1, developed all these products, etc. Each product can be in a different format, and then people generate products which they give a DOI to, and that's the thing that goes in the publication. The important point is there's a lot of history that goes on before you get to this right-hand side. Now, I've just recently got some funding with some others for the 2030 Geophysics Collection Project. And it's really interesting because we're actually being asked to investigate what we think we need our data to be like in 2030, not what you're doing now and what people want. And so we're making accessible online the lower levels of the MT and passive seismic data suitable for HPC, ensuring they comply with FAIR and CARE, and that we're exploring, well, if you're going to have exascale computers, what does that mean back to the data? And I take all aspects of the data, including credit for the funders and the people who created it. Okay, so dealing with my favourite data set, the Auslan Mt Data Set, it's proposed to have 3,000 sites collected on a 50 by 50 km grid, started in 2013, and how many years later? 8 years, we've got 1,300 sites collected, so we're not even halfway. We've got huge issues in long-term changes in software, hardware, standards and people. But the important thing is that we know already there's been significant changes in these 8 years, and there's going to be even more into the future. And how we used our processing algorithms 5 years ago and not what we're going to use today. And above all, thanks to Jared Peacock sitting there with a smirk on his face, the standards have changed. So we've got to go back to doing something with this legacy data if we're going to be able to do the whole thing. And so, as I said, it's the standard. You go out, you dig a hole, you take the machine. We're putting HPC into it, creating all these various levels of products, QA, QC, and then you put it out the door as a product. But the difference is that today, most people put their data out here at level 2 because that's in megabytes and that's what our bandwidths and data systems can hold. But there's this prehistory where you're dealing with data at gigabytes to terabytes. And up until now, that has rarely been released because people can't deliver it, they can't process it, etc., etc. So what you then do is you take the data set and get a couple of enthusiastic postdocs and you say to them, can you accelerate how I'm processing this? And you can sort of see over here on the right, we've got the traditional processing, how long it's taking, but what we were doing on the HPC machine using multiple cores. Okay, so what's this got to do with credit? Right, let's get onto that before Madison starts having a fit at me. But the important message I'm trying to get at is when you do that, you change the game because you're not reliant on those higher level products being the only thing that can be let out. You really need to let the lower levels of processing. And so what we've done is we've drastically reduced this time. More probabilistic analysis on spatially larger, higher resolution data sets is more possible. People can explore more parameters. And if you're a practitioner, you're no longer reliant on whatever the owner of the data gives you as the interpretation of the level 2 project. You can get in and do your own thing, do your own local conditions and get a better scientific product. So how do we then worry about credit if all we're doing or publishing in the paper are these level 2, level 3s? So we handled that by, because we've got a bit of extra storage, I suppose, on what most people have. And so we actually enable researchers to come in at any level of the processing. So if you like our level 1, take it, fill your boots. But if you don't like it, you can go back to the start and do the whole lot yourself. And more importantly, in our catalogue over here, stock standard GeoNetwork, each record is then related through parent-child, parent-child, parent-child. And so you can actually start to get more credit in on those earlier data sets because the level raw is where you credit the guy who, or girl, we're at there now too, who dug the hole. So what is moving credit roles in data integrated sets? You're then kind of looking at each level, and you can be actually really more specific and say, well, at this level, it was the collectors, it was the funders. At the level naught, that costs a lot to store data in gigabytes as opposed to a few megabytes. And so the funders can start to see credit for their repository. And you can see how you can get this more fully expanded credit put into this vertically integrated data set. But there's a bit of a problem that we're really emerging that's coming out. And going back to this diagram, we're calling it the invisible repository syndrome, because over here in the right is where the products are. And that's what's cited in the literature. Very rarely do people go back and say, my data set was derived through these stages, which you can through provenance and the fact that we've got each level of processing as derived from. But most journals today say, oh, this is the subset of the data that was used in the paper. And the poor repositories that are storing the bigger data sets are becoming invisible. So this is kind of my issue with credit, that in today's world, and it's going to get worse as computer power increases, as these young people have shown me, we've got to be able to get credit back onto those earlier levels, because otherwise, if the repositories are targeted, well, how many people have used your data set? They can't produce it because they're not seeing the trend going through to their products and being able to get the citations, the DOIs in the literature. And so I've just put Madison's famous questions here, and I'm asking that we need to still qualify what elements we're going to credit in these lower level data sets. But my basic question is we need to start giving them credit and realise that, speaking as from a big repository where we're not getting credit, it's an issue and we need to raise it. We're sort of saying what type of resources or information. One of the suggestions we've got is that research publications that are now religiously checking that the data set has a DOI, actually check whether there's a bit of a history to the data set that belongs to other groups that need to be recognised. And then how can authorities promote things and recognise people? I just cheekily put there, well, you can't do that unless we provide the means of bringing out of the darkness the invisible people that create, sustain those lower levels of processing. That's what you wanted? Yes.
All right, thank you, Leslie. Nope, no questions. We're not doing questions. You can put your question on a sticky note later, yeah, or they'll put it in chat for you to answer. Okay. Next up, we have Bob Downs. So Bob Downs serves as the Senior Digital Archivist and Acting Head of Cyber Infrastructure and Informatics Research and Development at CESN, the Center for International Earth Science Information Network, which is a research and data center of the Columbia Climate School of Columbia University. And his presentation is titled Linking Data and Credit for Research Artifacts. So it looks like you are sharing your screen, so take it away, Bob.
Oh, great. Well, thank you very much, Madison. And so I'm going to give you some use cases to begin with here. So from the perspective of a data center, you have a data set that's published, and then the organization that's affiliated with the data creation team, they might be the designated author of that publication. But on the other hand, individuals could be the designated authors, or it could be a combination of both. Another case is you have the original article, it's published about the data, and the team of authors of that original article, they could be the same as a team of data producers or not. Then we have a case on documentation, data documentation, where the documentation team may or may not be the same as a team of data producers. And then lastly, for software, the data producers or the software creation team may not be the same as the data producers. So thinking about all those different possibilities, we can start to look at some real life examples here at Cdec. And so in the Cdec data landing pages, what we do is we have recommended citations for both the data and the original article, and the authors of both are listed, as well as DOIs, of course, and the authors may be individuals or entities or both. And then for data documentation, the byline for the data documentation, that includes the individual authors or the entities. And the data documentation itself also contains recommended citations for various artifacts that might be related to the data. And then in the metadata for the data, you have a recommended citation for the data, and that could include the individual authors or the entities. And you also have links to related artifacts, whatever they might be for the data. And then regarding data citations, your article authors are providing credit for the data they used in the study, hopefully. We're trying to get that to be taken up more and more. And one of the ways, there are some carrots involved here, and that is by publishing on a repository the citations for data, then providing public access to those articles and the references to the data that cited the data provides recognition to give credit to the article author. So in a way that's a little bit of a two-way street there. I think that helps to make a difference if the authors of the articles cite, and then they will get cited. So we could look here at a couple examples from data set landing pages. And on the left, you'll see here that there's a whole long list of authors, and it's the same long list of authors for the data set as well as for the original article. On the right, on another data set landing page, you see we have the article author is actually an entity, the European Commission, and it's GRC at the European Commission, and the report that's associated with that is by individual authors. When we look at the data documentation, there are lots of different opportunities for authorship and for referencing all the different artifacts associated with the data. And so in a data documentation, we can see that the data set is cited, and then we can see that the suggested citation for the documentation is also there. And in both cases, in this instance, we're seeing all the same authors listed. That is, they not only created the data, but they all work together on the documentation for the data. Further on in that same documentation, you'll see a recommended citation for the data set, for the scientific publication, and for the source code as well. And so here you've got a few different entities or resources mentioned, artifacts. looking at the Cdec data documentation template, we can see there's lots of opportunities to give credit throughout the whole documentation. And so even in the appendix, you can list the contributing authors. For the source code, you can list that, as well as all the references to all the artifacts that are related, as well as ones that might have informed the development of the data themselves or the methodology used for the data. And we've seen acknowledgement section, et cetera. So there are lots of opportunities there. And when we look at metadata, at the top here, we're looking at a data site metadata record. And here we can see that they have the related identifier links for is referenced by or is documented by. And those are the same links as you see down below for the suggested citation for the data set, for the data set, and also, for the documentation, and then for the scientific publication as well. And I just wanted to also show you the Cdec citations database. This is where the people who have cited the Cdec data are listed in there, and they're searchable. People can be identifying a particular article that cited data, either getting from the data set itself or doing searches on this data base, and they can look at different types of publications, such as articles or book sections, etc. And so by having this public information about these citations, those who are citing the data are in fact being referenced here as well. So there's a little bit of value to them for citing the data. And then I just wanted to leave you with a thought in terms of balancing the research contributions and rewards here. As I believe Mark was saying earlier, this is what we have in terms of our rewards to science. We're often getting credit. And in order to get that credit, we need people to acknowledge the sources that they're using, as Leslie also had mentioned. So if we can all try to do that, I think we can help to balance the scale if we want to continue with that metaphor. Anyway, thank you very much for your attention, and we'll talk later.
Thank you very much, Bob. Next, we have two contributors. We have Ted Haberman, who's the founder and CTO of the Metadata Game Changers and is a longtime member of the ESIP community. And we have Kelly Stathis, who's the technical community manager at DataCite, where they lead adoption efforts and support development of the DataCite metadata schema. And their presentation is titled Contributors at DataCite.
Thanks, Madison. I'm going to go first. I'm Ted Haberman, as Madison said, and Kelly and I will be talking about contributors at DataCite. This is a few facts about what the contributor metadata element looks like at DataCite. It's a recommended property, not required. It's repeatable. You can have multiple contributors, and each contributor has a name and a type and a name identifier, and then an affiliation with the affiliation identifier for that contributor. So you can acknowledge people as well as the organizations that they're working for. The DataCite metadata includes 21 contributor types, and this list of 21 has been fairly stable for some time as the DataCite metadata schema evolves. Next slide. The first question we asked is how many contributors are there in the DataCite metadata? And there are two ways that we can look at that. DataCite has roughly a little over 2,000 repositories, and 41% of those include contributors. 41% of those repositories include contributors, so just less than half. DataCite has around 35 million or so records at this point, and about 38% of those records have some contributor information. So a fairly significant portion both of repositories using contributor types and also those contributor types showing up in records. Next slide. So what are the contributor types that are being used? Across the repositories, there's 4 or 5 that are being used sort of consistently in about 9 or 10% of the repositories. Other contact person, researcher, editor, and hosting institution. Others are used less than 9%, but a fairly even distribution of a number. In the records, the picture is a little bit different. 33% of the records include contact person, 15% include other, 12% hosting institution, and then from there on they fall out. So what this means, I think, is that there's some large repositories with lots of records that are acknowledging contact persons, and so they show up as a big number. How are repositories using contributor types? One way to answer that, or one aspect of that answer, is to see how many they're using. 44% of the repositories only use one contributor type. And in those cases, researcher is the most common contributor type used by itself. So many repositories only acknowledge acknowledge contributors as researchers. The last question that I'll take a look at is how are ESIP repositories associated with ESIP members using contributor types. This is a collection of 6 that I found. There are unfortunately many ESIP members that have repositories at DataCite that are not using contributor type. UCAR, there's 2 from UCAR, the generic UCAR repository and also the Earth Observing Lab. The numbers along the bottom here are the total number of contributor types they use. So in the UCAR cases, hosting institution and contact person are most common. The Office of Science and Technology Information at DOE is using the broadest collection of contributor types among these 6. Two groups from NOAA, the library first, is mostly using editor, although also a distribution of quite a few. NOAA NCI is just getting started in acknowledging contributors. They're using the distributor type. And then ORNL is using primarily researcher in their records. Now I'll turn it over to Kelly to talk about what's happening with contributor type metadata at DataCite.
Awesome. Thanks, Ted. And so yeah, now that we've kind of looked at what types of contributors are being provided and which repositories are using that field, the next thing we wanted to look at was what happens to contributor metadata once it's submitted. And when we investigated this, we found that there aren't very many places where contributor metadata is being used. And essentially creators are getting all the credit in different systems. One of the main practical distinctions we see between creators and contributors is how they are used in the formatted citation. And so creators are part of that citation and contributors are not. And for this reason, DataCite typically advises that for a contributor to be included in the citation, that they're also added to the creator field. Another place where contributors don't typically show up is in metadata aggregators like Google Dataset Search. The metadata just hasn't been surfaced in practice, even though contributor metadata is, of course, harvestable via DataCite's APIs. Also, tools like ORCID Auto Update that take advantage of connections between PIDs prioritize creators over contributors. However, one tool that does surface contributor metadata is DataCite Commons. And so Commons is our search interface, and it allows users to search for works, people, organizations, and repositories. And this page shows the metadata for a work. Here we can see that the DOI has a mix of different contributor types, hosting institution, contact person, et cetera, representing both organizations and people. And in this case, I think it's worth noting that the contributors are also creators. So that's why they do show up in the author list at the top, as well as in the citation. And here, the contributor field is more, it's providing additional context and clarifying the role of each author rather than crediting more non-author individuals. And so also when you search for organizations in Commons, each organization's page will include a list of associated works, including those where a contributor is affiliated with that organization. And in this example, one of the contributors is affiliated with Metadata Game Changers, and the ROR ID for this organization is an affiliation identifier. Commons also includes works where the organization itself is a contributor. And in this example, we see that Tatiaroa Society is a contributor to the work with the type sponsor. And the metadata includes the organization's ROR ID as the name identifier, which then enables the work to show up as associated with the organization. And so to wrap up, I think there are several challenges with contributors that we're grappling with right now. First, I think it's difficult to draw a hard line between who is a creator and who is a contributor. We define creators as the main researchers involved in creating the research output, and in citations, we only use creator metadata, not contributor metadata. And because citations are so important, this results in the distinction being that creators do get significantly more credit than contributors. Another difference in our current implementation is that contributors have types or roles, but creators don't. And we've seen various workarounds for this where creators are duplicated as contributors with their roles as contributor types. And so to start addressing some of these challenges for the next major schema version, the metadata working group is exploring some updates to how contributor types are implemented. We've had many requests for support for credit roles, but because DataCite already has a control list for contributor types, it's not straightforward to replace that list or to add an additional control list on top of that. And so we're looking at restructuring the property to allow for external taxonomies like credit to be plugged in, and also to allow for sufficient flexibility to look at different contributor taxonomies as needed for different fields and types of artifacts. We're also looking at turning the non-repeatable contributor type attribute into a repeatable sub-element so that we can have creators with or contributors with multiple roles. And we're also looking at having a role sub-element for creators. And the last two challenges I have here are more about adoption. Because contributor is not currently a required field, it's not always easy to encourage repositories to include complete contributor metadata. And as we've seen, we don't have many aggregators or other consumers of DataCite metadata who are actively using the contributor field. And this is basically then sort of a chicken and egg problem with adoption. It's difficult to get repositories to provide contributor metadata if it's not used, but it's difficult to get aggregators to use contributor metadata if it isn't consistently implemented. That's all we have for today. Thanks so much for having us, and we're happy to take questions in the chat and looking forward to the discussion.
Great, thank you so much, Ted and Kelly. Our final presenter is Phil Bourne, who's the former Associate Director for Data Science at NIH and is the founding Dean for the School of Data Science at the University of Virginia. And his presentation will be One Institution's Journey to Credit Research Appropriately. And let me pull up your slides really quickly, Phil.
Thank you very much. I'll get started. In the interest of time, thanks for the opportunity to say a few words about what we're doing. Really, as was indicated, this is really at the institutional level, and our institutional is a new school of data science at the University of Virginia. And just as you're undoubtedly aware, data science is an explosive field that's going on, I'm sure, in all of your own institutions to varying degrees. And it exists, in my mind at least, because of the open data methods that are out there. And it would be terrible for us to take all of that and create, if you want to call it a discipline, but not give back. So we actually started to, as we formed the school, which was about 2.5 years ago, how could we give back our research artifacts in the best possible way? And so I'm just going to tell you about the institutional journey that has led us to giving back as best we can. I think much of the work that you've all described today has relevance for how we think about the next steps in what we're doing. This is really more of an overarching institutional perspective, but it certainly leads into everything that you're talking about. What's really fortunate in all of this is we had no prior culture. A school, as you know, in an academic institution essentially has autonomy with all the other schools. So suddenly we had this whole blank slate for how we could develop a school. And so it was really a unique opportunity. There's no prior culture to overcome. The institutional culture is there, of course, but with supportive leadership, it was possible to actually do some interesting things. It started off with our faculty developing a set of open scholarship guidelines. So a subcommittee of our faculty got together. We'd already moved down this pathway significantly. We had a Wikimedian in residence within our school. We had several people, names you may know, that are involved in open scholarship, part of our faculty and our efforts. So they were part of this subcommittee, but so were a whole series of other faculty. And the library was also involved in this. That was absolutely critical. The library has played a very important role, particularly in things like copyright, in how we think about what we were putting together with respect to the guidelines. This, after some back and forward, there was a set of guidelines that were voted on by all of our faculty. And as a result of that, which this is absolutely critical, is that we also, if we were going to conform to those guidelines, then we had to change our developing promotion and tenure policies to really map to those guidelines. So we've actually turned around to some extent the regular ideas of what it means to be a scholar within, certainly within our field. And that gives us the opportunity to really meld these kind of things together so that there's not only developing guidelines, but there are also incentives to actually follow those guidelines. So all faculty were made aware of the guidelines. They all signed on informally. Every new faculty member, and we're hiring of the order of 10 to 15 new faculty a year. Sorry, there's probably a Harley Davidson in the background. And so when they sign on to the guidelines. It's an opt-out set of guidelines. At the end, I'm going to give you a URL. They're in the slides. You can go and download them if you're interested. So, we don't want to constrain people completely, but it's really an opt-out policy. Then the other aspect of all of this is the guidelines are only be followed if there's technology, an on-ramp that makes conformance painless. So we're developing that on-ramp, again, with the library, but also within our own IT group within the school, so that we're, for example, using the library's Dataverse instance. We have our own instance, what we call SDS Central, which is a repository for a variety of research artifacts. Of course, there's conformance in the ways that you all know better than I, with respect to faculty have to have ORCID IDs, they have to have a Google Scholar profile. All these artifacts have DOIs associated with them. And we're now starting to develop that on-ramp so that really the conformance also can be checked very easily at promotion and tenure time. And then we're part of annual reviews through the background automated processes that we're setting up. By some miracle at our institution, and I'm not sure they actually knew what they were signing on to, but our faculty senate at the university approved the guidelines for the institution writ large. If they'd known they'd come from the School of Data Science, they probably wouldn't have approved them because of the competition that exists between schools. However, it was presented as a sort of generic set from the faculty itself. That got approved, and as a result of that, those guidelines are now being developed as part of university policy. Are we still at the level of some of the more progressive policies that exist in some institutions? We're getting there. And so now, of course, the leadership of the institution is behind that. Interestingly, the stars were aligning because as this was all going on, a group from the National Academies in the US basically started to look at, for me, what is absolutely missing in this whole process of greater open scholarship, which is the funders were doing what they could, the publishers are going to do what they do, but the institutions are the ones, for the most part, writ large, that are behind the curve. So the National Academies, in recognition of this, have established a group called Helios, which a number of educational institutions have signed on to actually exchange best practices about the processes they're using to enhance open scholarship in their institutions, which of course involves the credit journey you've all been talking about. I'm the University of Virginia representative on that, and we now have our own open scholarship working group within the university that's committed to working with Helios and within our institution to move the ball forward. So what that means right now is to identify evangelists across the institution, across the disciplines, to really to help popularize and help incentivize what we're doing. Work with the Provost's office to develop the policy from these guidelines. That takes time, unfortunately, in a university, and continue and implement and make generally available the infrastructure to support what we're doing within, first of all, within our own school, but then more broadly across the university. We've got a way to go to do all of this, but I think there's been a pretty good start. And certainly the credit journey is part of that. And as it relates to promotion and tenure, of course, I think that is, in the end of the day, the most critical piece. So we're looking at basically changing what it means to be a scholar, such that data, software, other research artifacts are valued along very much on a par with papers and grants and other more traditional artifacts of research. So that's what we're doing. I'm in the throes of travel, so I'm sorry I'm not going to be able to stay on for the questions, but here's my emails here, and I'll be absolutely responsive to any questions that come up with what we're doing. And I encourage you to look at our policies. So thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Phil. All right, awesome. And you know what? We're ahead of schedule by 2 minutes, and I know folks are itching, so I'm gonna let one question happen. And I see that there was some discussion going on there. I'm gonna prioritize, apologize for remote folks, I'm gonna prioritize folks in the room first, since y'all are here and it's freezing, so somebody's gotta stand up and ask a question. So does anybody in the room have one question to ask any of our speakers? Okay, I guess since I said there was no question and answers, nobody was thinking about that. Are there any, so then I'm going to go online. Are there any folks online that would like to raise their hand and ask a single question? Okay, cool. Yeah? Okay, I wasn't reading their conversation, so if somebody was. Okay, Dan, can I put you on the spot and summarize the conversation that was happening in the chat?
I don't think the conversation in the chat can be summarized very quickly, and it's not a question, it's really a discussion that's kind of ongoing. So I don't think it's useful to try to do something in a minute.
Okay, sounds good. Well, we will capture what happened in the chat, and we will put it in our notes document. All right, it's already happened. So that's wonderful. So we have that captured, and we can kind of keep having that conversation as we move forward in our cluster. But what we're going to do next is, let me hop out of this screen if I can. I'm going to hop back in over here. And let's do this. So what we're going to do is a sticky note activity. Okay, so what I want you to do on here in the room, first I'm going to describe what's going to happen in the room, and then I'm going to describe what's going to happen online. So in the room, I have sticky notes on each of the tables. There's a little stack. If there's not one in front of you, look to your left or to your right, and you will find one. There are also pens in case you didn't bring pens, because some people didn't. But what we want you to do is think about the 3 questions that we asked before, and I'll put those back up in just a minute, and write your response, one response per sticky note. So if you have a challenge that you've seen or experienced related to assigning or recognizing credit for research artifacts, or if you can think of a resource or a tool or information that would be helpful to providing credit for research artifacts, or if you can think of, you have ideas kind of rolling around in your brain about ways that authorities can help kind of promote this type of credit. So we want you to document those on sticky notes, one idea per sticky note. And then around the room, there's 3 little papers, and I'm going to ask you to put your sticky notes under the question that it pertains to. So we're going to have around 5 minutes for you guys to think kind of quietly by yourself and write, but also get up and move around, because it is so cold you might get stuck to your chair if you do not. Online, folks, we have a Jamboard, and we're going to put that link in the chat. Or it should already be there. And we have a similar setup there. So there are 3 boards. There are sticky notes. You can create sticky notes and put them on each of the boards under the appropriate question. And what's going to happen is, I'm going to move this to the side. So after we take these 5 minutes to kind of think and put up our sticky notes, we are going to split into breakout groups. So there'll be 3 here in our room, and then there's going to be 3 virtual groups. And we're going to ask each group to take one of the questions in their sticky notes and review those, and kind of have a mini discussion in your group and think through what might the ESIP research artifact citation cluster be uniquely positioned to kind of take on with respect to some of those ideas that we're seeing on the sticky notes. And then we'll come back together at the end, and we'll have kind of 1 minute per group for each group to report on one major takeaway from the sticky notes that you all saw within your question, or part of the discussion that came out of looking at those. So one major takeaway from each group. So with that, I'm going to give folks 5 minutes, and then we're going to go ahead and split up into groups. Before we do that, though, are there any questions? And I'm going to put the questions back up.
Hey, Madison.
Yes.
I got an invite to a breakout room, but then I was listening to you and it went away. I guess I can click on this breakout rooms thing here.
Yes, I think you should be able to, but you don't have to go in there yet if you don't want to, but you can. There's no reason you have to wait, but we want folks to have the time to kind of think quietly by themselves, and put up those sticky notes. Yeah. And then if you have problems after 5 minutes getting into your breakout group, speak up again and we'll figure it out for you.
I was going to say, I think people did go into one of the breakout groups at that time, so there's probably a few people in one group that didn't hear you.
That's okay. They can be sitting there thinking quietly and then discussing.
Will the questions be visible in the breakout room?
They will be visible on the Jamboard.
Okay.
So folks have that. Can we send that link through to all the breakout groups? Okay, perfect. Our fellow is so on top of things. Okay, so 5 minutes. Okay, folks, it's been 5 minutes. I hope you've had some time to brainstorm on your own. So now, if you are not in your breakout rooms online, please go to them. I have no idea how to tell. So I'm gonna let you handle that. Okay, and then here in the room, I want you to actually get up and walk over to the poster that you want to have a discussion about. So stand up. Do you need help? And we have about 14 minutes now to kind of read through those Post-it notes that are there and have kind of a discussion about them and to come up with your one major takeaway.
I'm glad to see that Zoom can still yank us back from breakout rooms.
All right. Okay, so we have everyone back from breakout rooms, and we're going to go around and do our 1-minute report out. So I am going to start in the room and then move to online. So we're going to start with the question of the challenges.
So I'm not sure that we came up with a whole lot new. In sense, it was who gets credited and how. But so the roles are really important, and so what roles get credited, how do they get credited, and then finally, this is maybe the nuance that we added is how does the person find out that they were credited? You know, so Citation has mechanisms through your H-index and Google Scholar and things like that, but somebody uses an artifact in some other way, like a first responder using your data to put out a fire. You don't get credited for that. So, the challenge, I guess, is thinking beyond Citation for who gets credited and how. You want to add anything? Did I get it right?
Yeah, I can just like sort of elaborate on the how a bit more. How is, through either the type of contribution or the infrastructure, as in you cite it in this case, there's multiple identifiers. How do you properly cite them?
Okay, great, thanks. I'm gonna run.
Our group was looking at how can authorities such as promotion, hiring, funding committees, professional societies, or publishers be encouraged to recognize contributions of data products and other research artifacts. And it was really interesting looking at some of the things because it feels like too, like I'm not sure we have answers, and a lot of it is also feels almost like common sense, the provide examples, show value. But one of the things we were getting at, we liked this term, was the holistic credit picture, getting these organizations in different positions to understand that they are part of that whole view of credit, that they do have a role in it or they get a benefit from it. And particularly the idea of trying to show metrics somehow and connections. So the easy example is I'm a funder, now I can see who's benefiting or using or connecting to the things that I funded. Then you've got the things that might be more harder to figure out how to articulate to like a promotion and tenure committee of how do you evaluate the value of research artifacts when considering tenure. It's easy to say now with the publications or grant awards, but hopefully they would value research artifacts or what just as much as something, because now it can get a citation perhaps and then can be connected outwards to show the impact back into society. We had a few different examples too. It's already great that the NSF BioSketch is requiring or allowing these things to be added, and that's a good first step. The next step too might be having more publishers include spaces for and supporting these things. And I think that's some of the main topics. One of the tangential things was it's going to come down to PIDs though again for some of this stuff, whether that's to the citation or for the individuals who are being credited in the various roles. And I'm going to run it over to the other side.
Yes, thank you. For those online, it's very, very cold in this room, so everyone wants to run.
We're a shy group, sorry. Yeah, so we kind of came down to PIDs also in the end of things, but kind of PIDs are necessary to have any sort of linked data infrastructure implementation. And we also kind of talked about a little bit about capturing who should get credit, sort of defining those roles and making that widely available to people so they understand who should be in a citation. And there was given a DOI, an easy way to see derivative products and how many times they have been cited would be super useful.
Okay, great, thank you. We're going to move online. So we had 2 groups online, and let's start with room 1. First, tell us what your question you guys talked about, and then tell us what your takeaway was.
That may have been us. We were talking mostly about the challenges and some about what the differences between authors and contributors. And are those differences important? We decided at the end that incentives and tools were the 2 challenges. Incentives for people to report credit for multiple roles, and then challenges of using tools to integrate those acknowledgements into various systems.
Awesome, thank you. And room 2.
So we talked about each of the questions. For question 1, I think we had a general consensus that you kind of need to walk before you can start to run, and that is, there's a lot of work that needs to be done, but we've got to start somewhere to get the people to do things. When we talked about the resources and tools, we touched on the idea of automation. That is, given that there's so much information that people are being asked to contribute, not only in terms of credit, but you think about metadata records, et cetera, and documentation. If there were automated processes that would fill out some of these things like a form that enables the contributors to go in and just add things that aren't automatically captured, or to modify them, that might help a bit. And yeah, we talked about the committees as well, and this is a real problem. I think these are the blockers in many cases. And we talked about some institutions where those who are in power and have managed to get on these committees are not eager to open doors, any doors, for others. So there is much work to be done here.
Great, thank you so much. So I appreciate everybody and everybody kind of working together and sharing their challenges and kind of brainstorming some solutions. And we're going to capture everything that's here in the room and on the Jamboards. And we're going to continue having this discussion, kind of thinking through these questions and the responses here and trying to figure out our next steps. So if you are interested in this topic, we would love to have you join us. Our next meeting for the Research Artifact Citation Cluster is going to be August 11th at 4 p.m. Eastern Time. So please do join us. You can view our homepage at this link provided here, And you can also join our email list so you can get that reminder to come to our next meeting. So please do that. But for now, I'm going to say thank you so much for joining us and participating. And we will see you August 11th. Thanks.
Madison,
Yes.
can I mention one thing? Or if
Sure.
people,
Yes, go ahead.
I think we still have the room right, but actually, a little while ago, a couple of years ago, Aaron Robinson, who used to be, many of you know, the executive director of ESIP, and with a little bit of me, worked on a credit-related pilot project that might be interesting to this group. We went through the history of contributions that people had made to ESIP. So that was leading clusters, participating in clusters, running sessions, presentations at sessions. So contributions that many of us have made many of these contributions to the community, and there's no way to get credit for them. And we were using a tool called ResCognito, and I put a link into the chat. So ResCognito was an idea conceptualized by a guy named Richard Wynn and his wife, and it's a crowdsourcing way to provide credit for things that people do for papers or any research artifacts, or contribute to communities like ESIP. It's like we've talked about the idea with Susan and others on ESIP staff, and maybe at some point it'll be further developed. But that's a sort of a completely out of the box area of credit for something that many people in this meeting here right now and at the ESIP meeting have made significant contributions to the earth science data community, and ResCognito was a way to try and acknowledge that.
Thanks for sharing that, Ted. Yeah, we've discussed that in our cluster before, but it's certainly something worth kind of thinking about again now that as we're focusing in on credit and what that means to credit things. So thanks for sharing that again, and certainly something that we can continue to explore.
Thanks, Madison.
All right, well, with that, thank you, everyone, and let's go warm up.